All right, I think most folks have had a chance to join, so let's get started. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our panel on pandemic, populism, and democracy. My name is Keith Cherry. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Constitutional Studies, and I'll be the moderator for the discussion today. I'd just like to start by thanking the Center for Constitutional Studies and the University of Alberta for hosting this event and for bringing us together to discuss this unique political conjuncture that we find ourselves in, where our democracies are being reshaped by a rising tide of populist politics on the one hand, and also by the unprecedented phenomena of the pandemic and the styles of politics that have emerged from that. So our hope today is to reflect together on this conjuncture and on how governments are asserting themselves in this moment and how citizens are reacting and what all of this means for the practice of constitutionalism and of democracy moving forward. But before we jump in, I'd like to acknowledge with respect that the Center for Constitutional Studies is located in Edmonton on Treaty 6 territory, and that those lands are traditionally governed by Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Saulteaux, and Inuit peoples. I'd like to acknowledge the ongoing acts of settlement and colonization that are taking place on these territories. And I'd also like to acknowledge Treaty 6 and that the center, the university, and the city all continue to enjoy the tremendous benefits of that treaty. And so I'd like to express the center's commitment to working to uphold the spirit and intent of Treaty 6 and the nation-to-nation relationship that it represents. And I recognize, of course, that land acknowledgements like this one are only a very small part of upholding those commitments. I'd also like to acknowledge that I personally am joining from Lekwungen and Wasanich territories, subject to Douglas treaties in 1850 and 1852, respectively. And I'd like to express my personal gratitude for the benefits of those treaties and my respect for the ongoing authority of the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples on these lands and waters. And of course, in a virtual setting like this, I'd also like to acknowledge that our various panelists and audience members, many of you will also be joining from unceded or treaty territories around Turtle Island or across the world. So I'd like to acknowledge that as well. And with that said, let me introduce our illustrious panelists for today's discussion. So today we have joining us Dr. Una Fitzgerald, who's an international lawyer, an artist, and choreographer. She's a senior fellow with the Human Rights Research and Education Center and the director of the International Law Association of Canada. Dr. Pablo Uzao is a co-founder of the Cedar Trees Institute at the University of Victoria and a visiting fellow at the University of Southampton. And Pablo's research interests include public philosophy, collective presences, horizontality, nonviolence, and civic democracy. And Professor Jeremy Weber is former Dean of Law at the University of Victoria and at the University of Sydney. He's a fellow at the Trudeau Foundation and in the Royal Society of Canada. A word about our format today. We're trying something a little bit different and eschewing the traditional conference style of each speaker doing a 15-minute presentation one after the other. Instead, we'll be trying to make our conversation a little more dynamic and dialogical. So instead of each speaker moving through a kind of self-contained presentation, all three of our panelists will dialogue together on a series of broad questions that we'll move through over the course of the conversation. And then at the end, we'll have a chance to address some audience questions. So for those of you in the audience, you can submit questions at any time into the chat box. You'll also have the option of submitting your questions anonymously if you prefer to. And you'll have the option of upvoting questions that you like. So if you see someone else's question that you'd really like to hear addressed, you can give it a little thumbs up and that will move that question up the queue. So it may not be the case that we're able to get to every question that's asked, but at least we'll be able to get to those the audience is most interested in. And last, at the very end of the session, you'll see a feedback form will pop up in your window. And we're always trying to improve our formats and learn how to do these events better. So I encourage you to take a moment at the end to fill out that feedback form. And with that, let's move into our dialogue. So I'll start us off with the first kind of discussion prompt for our panelists, and then they can take it from there. And the question we wanted to begin with is, when you think about how our democracies have responded to the concurrent challenges of populism and also pandemic politics, what issues stand out to you? And Jeremy, would you like to start us off on this question? Oh, you're on mute there.
Thanks, Keith. And it's a pleasure to be with all of the people attending today and with these illustrious panelists. I guess what I'd like to start by saying is that when discussing populism and the pandemic, there often is a tendency simply to conflate the anti-vaxxing movement and other forms of resistance to pandemic measures and populism, as though they really were one and the same thing. And that, I think, is a mistake. It's important to realize that there has always been resistance to vaccination. There's always been, when it has been imposed, resistance to quarantine. And there's no doubt that and what lies behind that is that events like the pandemic really cause very substantial dislocation in society. People are hurting, they've lost family members, they've lost jobs, they've lost income. And when that happens, there is a natural human tendency to want to find quick fixes, to find ways to make it go away. And that has meant that there has always been a constituency for magic remedies, for snake oil treatments. And to a certain extent, that's what we're seeing now. But of course, if populists are good at one thing, they're good at latching onto forms of discontent and really running with them. That has its good side. It means that somebody is listening to those forms of discontent. I guess if there's a bad side, it's that often there's, among populists, a lack of careful analysis and a lack of follow through about how actually to address those concerns. Not always. Different varieties of populist movements, but sometimes it's simply a matter of telling people what they want to hear without a coherent plan and without a coherent way of moving forward. In fact, often with simplified enemies, personalized enemies that are blamed for the problem. So, I think what we need to do is we need to listen carefully, as the populists are, and think about what those foundations for concern are, and then find ways to build our political responses so that they are constructive, so that they're inclusive, so that they don't find scapegoats, and that we use this as a way of prompting serious re-engagement with governing ourselves together, the business of governing ourselves together.
Shall I jump in here? Thanks very much for those great introductory comments, Keith, and for Jeremy's opening. I just wanted to correct one thing. I'm a director of the International Law Association of Canada. We are many wonderful directors, so it's my pleasure to be among them. On this question that you're posing about how democracies have responded to the challenges of populism and the pandemic, I think that I would say that governments have been doing reasonably well, at least in Canada, but that we do see that there are a lot of long-term impacts on human rights. And if we look at those, the picture is a lot less positive. I am choosing to look at this question really from the point of view of human rights dimensions of the pandemic and the particular impacts on women and girls. So it seems to me that we all share a set of international principles that are reflected in our constitution. So international human rights are, central to the way Western governments operate and most governments around the world. And human rights are interconnected and indivisible. And what's interesting here is that we've got human rights that deal with issues that concern populism. So there's the right to be left alone, the right to freedom of expression, and the right to assembly and that sort of thing. But there are also rights, so those rights are found in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, along with other instruments, such as, for example, the Charter of the United Nations and the UN Declaration on Human Rights. But there's another set of rights that are also really important. And this is where I think we kind of find some of the impacts of the pandemic and the impacts of populism. And they are the rights that are referred to in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Those are the things like the right to an education, the right to public health. And we have seen that these rights have been, to some extent, they've been elevated by the pandemic, and that has been a positive thing. Normally in the West, like in the United States and in Canada, we don't put a big emphasis on social, cultural, and economic rights. We tend to focus more on the sort of negative rights of being left alone, the right against search and seizure and that sort of thing. But right at the beginning, when the World Health Organization declared the pandemic and the shutdowns began across nations, it was apparent that if people were going to be deprived of their livelihoods and their freedom of movement, they would need their basic needs to be met, in terms of access to healthcare and emergency financial benefits. And we did see some quite incredible efforts by governments to address those issues in the short term. Over time, we've seen that there are some problems with gaps in those benefits provided, and it hasn't been sufficient, but it was an interesting, very interesting development, which I think allows us to think more about those social, economic, and cultural rights going forward. Maybe I'll just stop there for now to allow my colleagues to jump in.
Yeah, I agree with what both of you have been saying, and I'm not here to say whether the governments have done a good job or not, but I do worry that if this kind of events are going to happen more and more, one of the things that worries me about how we've going through the pandemic is the fact that, if I have seen anything, is at least in the Spanish context, is the absolute centralization of power and decision making. I see very little space for any debate about how we could do things or whether we could do things better. So that would be one thing. I feel that any kind of participatory democracy seems to be put to the side whenever we are facing these crises, and it does seem like these crises are going to be more frequent as we progress, especially when we begin to think about climate change and things like that. So that would be one aspect. The other aspect would be the way that, for example, you look at the contracts that the pharmaceutical companies have signed with Europe, and they keep the patents, but they have no liability. And I find that incredibly disturbing, right? That would be another aspect. Another aspect is the way that bailout money, and this is speaking from the European and Spanish context, but another aspect that I find disturbing, and it also relates to the financial, is how these bailouts are actually, all this money that is going into, for example, Spain. What was interesting for me is that one of the biggest, one of the early funding that came from Europe, it went straight into buying military equipment for the Spanish government. So I find hard to, the excuse was to keep jobs, but my question is, if we're dealing with a pandemic, why all of a sudden are we investing in military technologies, which in this case are Eurofighters? It's the first thing that the Spanish government did, was to order some Eurofighters with the European funds. I worry about these things. So just to set the ground of where I'm thinking from here in Spain.
Yeah, one of those, if I could respond, in fact, I think what often happens in crises like this is one tends to kind of want to read the tea leaves about where things are moving. And it's particularly difficult to think about where things are developing because things are happening quite differently in different societies as well. Different governments have responded in different ways. And I have to say that I do see, especially in the context that I know best, kind of remarkable signs for hope, including about people taking responsibility themselves for developing solutions to the question. And let me just give the one that I think for me is most striking, and that is how quickly and how effectively a large number of First Nations moved in order to protect their communities and control access to the communities. And that was really striking and quite remarkable, and something that I think is a sign of the resurgence of governance welling up within those communities, right, by people taking charge of their own destinies. And one sees, I guess, perhaps in a more diffuse way, at least aspects of that occurring more broadly. Municipalities taking significant action. Individuals kind of in their daily lives and their interactions taking some real responsibility for making sure that their surroundings are safe, and not necessarily in a kind of punitive or kind of a fashion that's purely driven by fear, but that really is a matter of taking responsibility for the collective safety. So who knows which of these are going to be prevailing, but one can't help but see that there are some real attempts to take responsibility, and perhaps even some extension of that sense of taking responsibility to the action of governments generally.
I really like that idea that you're bringing up about this, that there's more responsibility, and it is hopefully something that we can build on. But let me just suggest that like some of this responsibility is on the backs of people. And, there's been a lot of data collected on how this pandemic is affecting women, that they have lost their jobs at a greater numbers than men because of their work in precarious jobs or in the informal economy, which has been just decimated around the world. And that they've had a much harder time getting jobs back. So because they work in the service sector, retail, and that sort of thing. Also, they've been hit very hard, strangely hard, by the pandemic. We know that, in fact, COVID is a disease that is harder on men physically. But in fact, the numbers suggest that women are dying more from it because of their involvement in the healthcare system. So because, for example, in the province of Quebec, 54% of the people who died were women, which is kind of odd given the numbers and given the way COVID works. But it's because so many of them work in care homes or residents of homes. So just that issue of care homes impacts very harshly on older people, and particularly older women, because of course they do tend to live longer, and on the people who work in those homes, who tend to be women in relatively precarious jobs, often needing to work 2 jobs. So they were put at risk by the disease. They were ignored by governments to a large extent. We're just seeing reports of that in Ontario with the Auditor General's report and CBC reporting. There's also been a huge upsurge of domestic violence. So even though it's true that people have sort of gathered within the home and they're looking after each other, the home is not always a safe place for people. Lesbian and gay and transgendered people are going to be at more risk in some family settings. Women and girls are in danger in some settings. Children who are impoverished are going to be more endangered in a family setting. So it's really important that we keep track of how things are actually affecting people, and deal with that. So, there's an interesting idea that Hillary Charlesworth talks about, and that's trying to look at law by asking questions from the opposite end. So instead of thinking, what are we doing to protect women? Maybe it's also really good to ask questions about, well, if I didn't want to protect women, can I get away with it? And how does the law allow me to do that? And I know it's a very weird exercise to do, but if one asks those kinds of questions, we realize that the way law is structured, it actually doesn't really protect women. And for example, right now, the UN Women has said that 243 million women and girls aged 15 to 49 experienced violence at the hands of their intimate partner last year, referring to this as, and the UN Women refers to this as a shadow pandemic. So, just this issue of being in the home is a very dangerous setting. The other way that women are affected is reproductive health. So the right to access to birth control, the right to access to supplies for menstrual cycles, the right to access to abortion. All these things become harder when you're impoverished, when you don't have access to, if the shops don't have these things, if you don't have the money to buy them. And abortions, of course, are, they're usually very much a last resort, but they have been closed down to many people over the last, during the pandemic. And that presents a real challenge around the world. So, this has been described as a she-cession as well, an economic and social disaster for women. So I think we need to keep track of that and figure out if law is not really protecting women, if neutral approaches to solving problems actually continue the discrimination that is affecting women more severely, that we need to look deeply into finding new ways of addressing those kinds of challenges.
Yeah, I would like to take up something that Jeremy was saying about, local governments taking on, more responsibilities. And I do see that. But the problem is, from where I'm looking, which is Catalonia, where there's a conflict between the political state, between the Spanish government and the Catalan government, what this taking power actually ultimately ends up meaning in the context of the pandemic is that, they seem to be fighting to see who can, confine us the most. And it seems really strange, but I mean, we're living, again, we live a confinement. We have curfew at 10 p.m. The first 3 months of the pandemic we spent at home without being able to even go out. We were threatened with 600,000 euro fines. The general of the Spanish military was coming out every morning saying we're at war and we have to act like this. So within that context, it does seem to me that perhaps we are getting. Perhaps there is some value in this local governments being able to take more powers to do things. It doesn't seem like the powers are, I mean, I can understand within the context of the pandemic, but I also worry because I see that they also make, like we're currently in a state of alarm, and on the 9th of May, the state of alarm finishes in Spain. And here we have the Catalan government fighting to change legal situations so that they don't even have to declare a state of alarm in order to confine us. So, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be doing this way, but I do think we should be paying very serious attention to what laws are being changed and how that can affect us in future in other situations, because I wouldn't like to spend the next 30 years of my life going from pandemic to pandemic to pandemic, or to, climate change issues, going through, a set of very oppressive measures that don't, basically they're very erratic measures. That's the other thing. So it's very hard to actually decide what you can do. One weekend they say we can open up, the next weekend they say we're shutting down. People start their, all their activity, they open up the hotels, that costs money, they adapt everything to be ready, and then it closes down. So, I think that if I was going to judge the quality of the response to COVID, I would say within a capitalist neoliberal frame, it's been quite effective. But I think that we should be looking to use the COVID and all this to actually change our frames from neoliberalism and capitalism to other things. And I think if we did that, if we started to imagine what a response that is non-neoliberal could look like, then we would see things like for example, the vaccines not having no liability or being open so everybody can have vaccines, right? Without huge money being made by these corporations, right? And also things like the bailouts. Companies are borrowing money from the governments, and they're spending that money to buy their own stock, which basically is inflating markets, right? But that's making them money. So you have, all of a sudden, you have an increasing wealth gap during the time of pandemic. And I would have liked to see a decreasing wealth gap in the time that the pandemic has gone, rather than an increasing one. And I think that's something serious that needs serious consideration.
I think what you're saying, Pablo, that I think all of us would agree with, is that the responses we take now are going to be steps towards what we want our governance arrangements to be going into the future. And my sense is that the only way we can deal with those really important issues that Una was talking about, and in fact about entrenched inequalities within our societies that have been getting worse long before the pandemic, is by realizing a greater degree of participation and a greater degree of involvement. One of the things that strikes me that populisms have always done is they have worked off of existing dissatisfaction with the governance arrangements, which there has been. I think actually growing substantially in proportion to the growth of economic inequality in our societies in recent decades. And it really is time that we begin to act in a way that recognizes the stake that people generally have in the society, and that fosters participation, that listens. I loved what you said, Una, about Hilary Charlesworth's kind of vision of looking at the law from the point of view of people who have not had the law, have not seen the law as being on their side, certainly not all the time. And to think, we can't do without arrangements for governance. We can't deal with issues like climate change without finding ways to come together effectively in large units. And the question is just, how are we going to restructure our modes of political participation so that those voices aren't lost, so that they're heard, so that there's responsiveness, so that our political life is inclusive, and our governments can do the jobs that they have to do to meet the challenges that we face. Not just the pandemic, climate change, entrenched problems of inequality, including women's inequality.
And I would just add to that it's very concerning at this time, because we're less than 10 years away from the goal of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, which include things such as achieving gender equality by 2030. But that's just one of many really important goals: ending poverty, ending hunger, ensuring education for all, decent work for all, health for all. These, you think of all the intersectional issues that arise around these issues and how we're going to get there in nine years. It's very problematic. But then if you add on to that, the environmental goals that we need to meet to address the climate crisis, the biodiversity extinction crisis. So these are goals of climate action, protecting life on land and under the sea. We really have to get moving. Like, there's so much work that needs to be done. And so every move that goes in the other direction really needs to be called out. And of course, there are a lot of them. Like, we've been seeing in Canada that I think in Alberta and certainly in Ontario, that the lockdown has been used as a great time for the government to roll back on environmental protections, where while people are not likely to be demonstrating that sort of thing, and they've been doing it for what's viewed as the greater good, which is to spur economic recovery. But we have to hold so many ideas in our head at the same time right now if we're ever going to achieve those sustainable development goals. And that is creating a world that includes a healthy environment to live in.
I appreciate that. Something that strikes me from this first round of conversation is the tension between the universality of the issues we're facing: pandemic, climate change, economic inequality, political participation, and then the very localized and particular ways that these issues are playing out in different locations across the country and around the world, and even within different demographics of the population. And I was wondering if anything stands out to you when you look around that variety, cases that are particularly instructive, particularly worrying, or particularly hopeful, or patterns or similarities or contrasts that strike you as informative. Pablo, do you want to start us off this one?
Well, I mean, I think the most hopeful thing I've heard was the way that Jeremy was describing the way First Peoples are responding to the pandemic. I think that's, but it's also interesting because, for all the injustice and everything that they've had to endure, the truth is they kind of find themselves in an interesting space where they can actually be a bit more innovative with the way they govern themselves, right? Because I mean, I seem to be trapped in my case, I'm trapped in a constitution that was drafted by, while a dictator was dying, and he was passing his powers to a monarch. And, a couple of weeks ago, we had a socialist government, our socialist government, our minister of, I don't know what minister it was, but one of the ministers of the socialist government was saying, in Spain, we've achieved what the Republic was dreaming about through a constitutional monarchy. Now that sounds okay for people who think of the British monarchy or others, but in our context, our monarchy was completely supportive of the fascist project, right? So it becomes quite problematic, especially when we actually look at the fact that our monarch is currently in Abu Dhabi because he was supported, that the Spanish government supported making sure that he could get there so he doesn't face extradition from Switzerland, because that's where he's being tried for some of the corruption scandals that that the government in Spain refuses to pursue, right? We're not allowed to ask any questions, right? So the situation in Spain, I think it couldn't be in a worse situation to enter into the kind of crises we are facing. We have a constitution that was presented as exemplary across the world. We had all these wonderful constitutionalists describing it as what a wonderful transition that we had, but they forgot to look into the fact that the police didn't reform, the banking system didn't reform, the corporations today, the biggest families are still the families that were ruling financially speaking when Franco was in power, right? So we go into that with a Catalan independence movement, with people in prison. We have rappers who are singing against the corruption of the king who are in prison, right? So we have a pretty tense political space, right? An endemic corruption problem. I mean, the kind of corruption we live with in Spain, it's not, every time I speak with Canadians, it's hard to explain, right? I mean, the last government, I always say this, they had, the last government, the right-wing center government had 1,000 people facing corruption trials while they were governing the country, right? So, I mean, that's the kind of political space in which we are receiving money from Europe, which is being spent, which is going to cost the Spanish taxpayer a lot of money, right? And we know that this money is coming in, but it's, if one understands the political culture of Spain, then very quickly you realize that the money comes in and it very quickly disappears into fiscal paradises, into the accounts of the people that are friends with the corrupt politicians. And it's pretty much across the board. So we have that problem. We have the Catalan independence movement. We have a rising far-right movement, which in the case of Spain is different because it ties to the historical legacies of fascism, which are still hard to, I mean, we still have problems taking away, road names from cities with, which are, giving recognition to fascist leaders that have exiled, 50,000 people or killed people. So, I see Spain as a very negative space to look at. I think we can learn a lot from it. I think it really puts in, one of the things I've been really thinking about was this sort of shock doctrine of Naomi Klein's. I think it really plays really well in the Spanish context. There's a crisis. What are the policies we want to push through? And then all those policies come through, right? And then there's a kind of the population, not to just blame the politicians, but through an education system of 40 years of dictatorship and a transition to democracy, which really wasn't that, it wasn't that exemplary. It was very hollowed out democracy at best. Then you have this kind of social fascism in the mindset of the people. So there's a tolerance, there's a high tolerance to very oppressive scenarios.
I could add some comments about what's happening elsewhere in the world, because that snapshot of concern that Pablo is able to give in great detail, it does seem like it is reflected in many other countries. And it does seem that, well, according to Michelle Bachelet, who's the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, that in fact, human rights, the COVID-19 pandemic is in a sense being used to excuse human rights violations, affecting people's freedom of mobility and public assembly. And just to list a few examples of it, where we know what's happened in Myanmar recently, and what is the rest of the world doing to address it? We know what happened in Hong Kong. With the crackdowns and the passage of the new security law, it's very difficult for people to react when we're all in lockdown. China's also appears to have taken advantage of this crisis to crack down further on the Uyghurs, and again, what is the public reaction? I know there have been attempts to, to sanction China for this, but not much in the way of success there. And then there've been just crackdowns in weird ways, like the British police attacking a vigil for a woman who it turned out had been murdered by a police officer. Nobody, I guess, knew that at the time. But they cracked down in a violent way against these women protesting against violence against women. We've heard, I think it was just yesterday or this week, that Human Rights Watch is saying that Israel's practices amount to apartheid against the Palestinians. There's been use of anti-terrorism legislation in many places to basically crack down on any kind of opposition. So that has occurred in a number of countries. Indeed, in India, we heard recently this week that Twitter had to respond to some law and take down opposition statements on Twitter that were, opposed to the government's actions or inactions or failures with respect to the pandemic in the terrible conditions they're having right now in India. So, Nigeria, there have been very violent crackdowns by security forces. In the Philippines, there's been approaches like that. In Brazil, there's been a huge increase in the number of police killings. Between January and June of last year, it amounted to 17 deaths per day. So, and we've heard about in Hungary that there have been crackdowns. So I think that there's a real tendency for governments that want to exert control to use something like a pandemic to do that. And this is definitely a concern for anyone who's worried about the state of human rights in the world and the conditions of people who are more disadvantaged in those societies. So I think it'll be really important to see how do we improve human rights conditions around the world. They seem to be degenerating to quite an extent. And this doesn't help when the UN system, the United Nations, is in a state of deadlock, where the United Nations Security Council, which should be giving useful guidance and direction to the world, is in fact just locked in its own power politics between the permanent members. So there's definitely a need for reform and approaches to address these serious problems that are occurring.
I think what Pablo and Una have just said is absolutely right, and that there are these real challenges with governments taking advantage of the constraints that are imposed by the pandemic to pursue policies that are anti-democratic. And I guess the question then is, what's the remedy to this? And my own feeling is that thinking about it exclusively from the largest units is a problem. That the lifeblood of democratic societies comes from below. It's the engagement of the citizens in their own governance, and that what we should be doing is looking to foster that, looking to foster the democratic cultures in our own countries, and see whether that forms the basis for solidarity with democratic cultures elsewhere. Sometimes the protest and the critical dimension is seen as being somehow in opposition to democratic processes. And it is, those things are not. They are the lifeblood of democratic processes. I remember being really struck. That kind of opposition, kind of sense that these were opposing tendencies was quite prominent at the time of the Occupy movement, now quite a few years back. And I remember being really struck by the fact that absolutely grassroots activism that was occurring during the Occupy movement, in fact, was the way into larger political engagement in larger units for many people. That the fostering of engagement and of participation, including calling out things that need to be called out, is really the foundation. So, I guess, Una, one of the responses that I think, and I'm sure you would agree, is this should drive us to think about our own democratic processes and about our own structures of engagement, and to foster voice. You're absolutely right, Una, that it's in fact a constraint on that voice that has opened up more space for the terrible reversal of whatever democratic progress had been made in Hong Kong, for example. It opens up space, or at least the regimes hope it opens up space for things like the crackdown in Myanmar. And I think we have to realize that in responding, we have to respond with our whole societies, right? We have to be looking after our democratic processes at home, as well as reaching out in solidarity to people who are facing extremely difficult challenges elsewhere.
Yeah, and I was just going to add that in regards to, protecting our own democratic process, it also, not opening up the political space to the population. It's actually what I think, and this is following what Chantal Mouffe has been arguing all this time. It's actually fueling right-wing populism, right? It's like, if you have so-called democratic governments that every time are like, when they have an opportunity to be more democratic, they choose to be less democratic, then that's feeding the anger that is going to the right wing. And I think that one of the things that we need to think about is that if we want an antidote to right-wing populism in our societies, then I think the answer is more democracy, more bottom-up democracy, and actually beginning to solve these emerging problems that are emergencies, but not automatically, going to the very vertical decision-making powers every time there is an emergency. I think there is space. I think there would have been a space, for example, in this pandemic to actually have, plebiscites where people were asked how we wanted to respond. And I would have been much more comfortable with the kind of lockdowns that we've had if it was something that, a large part of the population decided it through actually being asked, but we never were asked, and we haven't been asked yet, right? So I think that the democratic, the representative system, it's actually, suffering quite a lot because of the way that those in it are actually choosing to, in a way, reinforce the status quo without giving opening to something that, as you said, from the Occupy movement, we've been hearing people want. But it's not just the Occupy movement. The Indignados in Spain and all the movements that have followed, all the First Nations movements in solidarity, with settlers in solidarity with them. They're all asking for the same thing. They want more decision-making powers. That's what I keep hearing anyway. But it seems like there's that the ears are being covered every time that's being shouted.
And if I can just add something that I'm sure you'd agree with, Pablo, and that is that it's not just a matter of the mechanisms, the kind of vehicles for voice that we're talking about here. The more I think about it, the more I think that we've got to do something to reverse the trend towards greater economic inequality in our societies. That inequality really subverts the democratic process. It means that people without economic security are not able to participate in their collective lives the way others are. They rightly don't feel, frankly, that they have the same stake in what's being done by the governments. It has an impact on all of the kind of situation of gender and sexual minorities that Una was referring to. It dramatically constrains their options if they're in circumstances that are intolerable. So my sense is that we have for too long neglected the fact that a substantial measure of economic equality is one of the preconditions, you could say one of the elements of the Constitution of a viable democratic society. And we have lost sight of that big time in the last 4 decades.
Yeah, it's true. Like the issue of equality is such a fundamental one right now. And, I wondered at the beginning when we were seeing these positive moves in Canada, to provide some social benefits and income support to people. And we were talking about the problems with the supply chain that, things were being stopped. We weren't sure of security of supply chain. We didn't have enough personal protective equipment. I thought, oh, well, maybe this will make us realize that that corporations need to be in the service of the public interest, that they really need to serve us. And I still hold that thought, but it's not what we've seen, right? We've seen that it has been just a bonanza for anybody who wants to hoard supplies or make money out of the pandemic. Like it's gruesome, Amazon with their terrible working conditions, with employees getting sick on the job. I mean, it's ridiculous in Canada where we have a public health system, why they cannot provide sufficient protection to workers, but they don't, and yet they get richer and richer. And so I really think we need to think about that. And that idea of asking questions from the other side, asking questions from the point of view of if I am a corporation, what can I do? Like, how can I exploit the masses? I mean, just ask the questions. You'll see you've got all the answers. The world is set for you. You don't have to pay for pollution unless there's a specific law about it. Go out and pollute. If you want to pay crap wages, if you want to make part-time jobs for people so they're insecure, you have perfect freedom to do that. So we need to do a lot there. And I guess the one thought I had, one positive thought, about the possibilities of more democracy is that we are learning that we can talk to each other across great distances. So here I'm talking to you folks from Ottawa, from unceded Algonquin territory. Pablo is speaking to us from Spain. You folks are out west, with Jeremy even further out west on the coast. And we can talk to people around the world much more easily this way and across our country. So that provides avenues that politicians and organizers need to use effectively. And just my other thought about democracy that where I'm now hesitate, because I'm sort of exploring this idea of new materialism and the idea of our relationship with the environment and with non-human. It does seem to me that we have to expand our concept of democracy to include those without voice as well. So it includes the trees, it includes the the sky floating by, etc. Like we need to figure out ways to include that it's not just this kind of maybe we've almost come to peak democracy in the sense we've ended up with this terrible polarization, right, of two sides of humans constantly in battle, like what we saw, especially in the US, and I guess is replicating in many other countries. But I think we kind of need to open that conversation up to something else, which is the non-human, that is also extremely important to take into consideration. And that includes, when I say non-human, it's the natural world, but it could also be the artificial intelligence, the machine world that we live with as well. So that's part of the challenge, is creating a democracy that addresses those types of issues.
I agree that we have to address those issues. I guess I can't see how we can get away from the fact that we as humans are the vehicles by which we organize our governance. And so it's our responsibility to pay attention to those things. And I guess I have to say that one thing that I am hopeful about is that one sees, for the first time in a long time, much more serious recognition of the effects of inequalities of wealth, and much more significant recognition of the utter interdependency that we have with other living beings on the earth. And that who knows where those processes are going to go, but there's just no doubt that those issues are becoming part of the primary political conversation, even in the United States, right after the kind of dramatic kind of change of government, in a way that has not been the case before. When have we seen an attempt to put in place a frankly redistributive budget of the kind we've seen in the United States in recent decades, when it seemed like every government moved it in exactly the opposite direction? Now, it would be nice if our governments too could see the importance of economic redistribution in a way Canadians once did. I think that would be, we could now act on those issues more effectively than we've been doing.
Yeah, and I was just gonna, add a hopeful part from my perspective. I think I do have hope, and my hope is in this, not in how I've seen the response to the pandemic, but in the fact that over the last 10 years, we've seen a lot of movements on the streets that are asking for more democracy, and not only asking for it, they're actually practicing it. They're showing us the kinds of practices that they're referring to. They're prefiguring the democracies that we could have, right? And just because to think that these movements are not there, that these people have disappeared, that they've stopped thinking this way, it's not how it happens. How it's happened is that a lot of police persecution, a lot of legal attacks, a lot of pressure from a lot of acquiescent media with the governments that have been having a go at these movements. And I think that I think that once the pandemic is under control, once most people have lost the fear of death that the pandemic brings, I think we will see a reactivation of the kinds of movements that we've seen. I don't think they've disappeared, right? So yeah, that and then on a adding to that positive note and thinking, what is it that what I think we need to do is more dialogue. We need to break those divides. We need to change the antagonism to agonism. You know, we don't need to look at we can look at adversaries, not enemies, and that brings a whole new way of relating to each other. We need to, you know, again, borrowing from Chantal Mouffe, we need to listen to the voices of those that we think are the extreme, the far right. What is it that they're saying? You know, and in those demands that they're making, how many of them are actually democratic demands? Because just because someone is on the extreme of the far right, it doesn't mean that every demand that they make is not a democratic demand. So I think we need to have a predisposition, and I think I have to say, from my experience in Canada, at least in the West Coast in Victoria, there does seem to be more of a predisposition for dialogue again amongst differences than I see in Spain, but that perhaps is in the mainstream, whereas in the margins of Spain, you do see a lot of very advanced democratic practices, and I'd like to see those coming back in.
It does seem that from all the time we've had, you know, to reflect on what we're going through globally and observing what's happening around the world, that there is so much to think about, and it probably reinforces a lot of these issues that we've been talking about, you know, like the Greta Thunberg and her movement for climate action, and the sort of sense of guilt that I think we have to feel about how we are treating the environment. I think we are reflecting on that. I think seeing the suffering that's going on in India right now and elsewhere in the world, in Brazil, I really do hope that this makes people sort of reinvigorated to be more passionate about and more committed to finding a more equal ways of engaging together. You know, like creating a society that is more equal, that does not allow people to become ridiculously wealthy and, you know, and have ridiculous power as a result. You know, I mean, we all, I mean, the beauty of the idea of democracy is that it's one person, one vote. Right? It's the idea that each person has a say. But we know when we look at U.S. politics and even in Canada, despite reforms we've had, that you know, some people have more vote than others, and not necessarily at the ballot box, but they have more power just because they are more wealthy. And the more we can move back to that idea that it's, well, the humans, they're the important, we are important to each other, and we should all have more of a say. I think that would be a good improvement. And if we can, you know, really take into account these issues around the environment and how we relate to it, and learn from people who do this better than we do. So I think, you know, ideas of stewardship, the idea of thinking of more generations, which Greta does, right? She is the one who tells us, like, think of us. You'll be dead when we're being fried. You know, it's not right. But the indigenous idea of looking 7 generations back and forth, and honoring our past and honoring the future, and trying to make a world that is going to be a good democracy for the future, you know, thinking long term. I think we have to kind of change our behavior in the short term. And just that long term view, I also think is really useful to look way back into history and prehistory, and think about what it was to be human, you know, 50,000 years ago, you know, 60,000 years ago, and what our relationship was with nature then and with each other. And, you know, even though the history that we know today is very much shaped by kind of the Bible, you know, whatever happened in the last 3,000 years, our life on the planet goes way further back. And we need to honor that past and sort of try to build a future like that, you know, that will go on for a long time, which means greater harmony with the environment.
Thank you for that. Our last question for discussion was, how would you like to see our democracies respond moving forward? But I think you've all moved into that quite naturally already. So I'd like to start to transition into audience questions, but before I do, does anyone have a last thought they want to offer so that I'm not truncating your contributions? Okay, great. Let's move into a couple of audience questions then. This one comes from David, who's wondering about the authority that governments use to enforce shutdowns in a context where people have a constitutional right to freedom of movement, freedom of religion. And David's asking, from where do governments get the authority to curtail those rights in order to enforce shutdowns?
Well, I guess I'll get a crack at that. Rights are never absolute. In fact, rights are constructed by us. They're constraints that through our political processes have been established over time within human societies. And especially in times of pandemic, and this is not new to this pandemic, we've tended to lose sight of the fact that there can be medical emergencies over which we do not have immediately mechanisms for effective response. But there was a time when these pandemics were much more common. And then there has been a need for quarantining, for requiring that people slow the pace of these kinds of diseases while solutions are developed. And that's what's happening now. And it is something that is included as those rights were being developed in the sense of what had to be the counterbalancing ability to preserve life at a time when assembly could potentially cause the spread of an extremely dangerous condition. And that's what we're facing. We're facing, if our ancestors, not very old ancestors, faced it at the time of the, for example, at big time, the influenza pandemic following the First World War. It's just, we've become so used to the progress of medical science that we have lost sight of the fact that we have our own responsibility for keeping ourselves and each other safe when there is a threat of this kind that is not subject to medical control immediately.
And I would just add that it's interesting that we're seeing it in action, right? Every day as we go in and out of lockdowns, because it seems to happen fairly regularly. Hopefully this is the last one for a while. But this idea of limitations on rights, they're supposed to be, in order to put in place limitations on rights, they have to be proportional. They have to be measures that are, reasonable limits that are sort of consistent with what other free and democratic societies are doing. And so there's a whole, that test around reasonableness, proportionality. Does it make sense? Is it targeted? Is it going to achieve the end that it seeks to do? And normally this would be the sort of question that goes through all the layers of the courts, and we have had a few cases going to court, but not as many as because court cases take a long time. But we see it in the public discourse about the lockdowns. In Canada, for example, I think it was about 2 weeks ago in Ontario, there was a cabinet meeting, and then they came out and they imposed all these lockdowns, very strong lockdown that included things like children weren't allowed to play in playgrounds, tennis courts were closed, and the borders were closed with the province, etc. And it immediately elicited like this reaction that, well, the doctors were all saying exercise outside is like the one thing that's going to save our health, our mental health, etc. And of course, if you live in a small apartment, a crowded small apartment, You need to be able to get outside and go to a public park to get exercise with your children, right? I mean, it's going to impact you much worse than somebody who has a lovely big house with a big backyard and possibly their own tennis courts. So, I mean, it was just so disproportionate and so extreme that I think it was within 12 hours or 24 hours, they had to backtrack on some of these measures because the public was just, no, it doesn't make sense. And even the doctors all came out and said, we've had it, we're thinking of resigning if you stop making these measures. Sort of another example, it maybe doesn't quite answer this point, but one thing we've really been struggling with in Ontario is paid sick leave. And I think right now our premier is on sick leave because he's certainly under quarantine because he was exposed to COVID. But the best they can come up with is a plan to give people 3 days paid sick leave. And the medical information is you need to be at least quarantined for, I don't know if it's 7 or 10 days, but it's a period of time, right? And so any restrictions or even benefits, they all need to make some sort of sense in a juridical sense, but also just in the public interest sense of what's reasonable.
Yes, for example, in Spain, you have to wear a mask outside. But I mean, that means that by law, if I'm in the middle of a forest and there's no one in a radius of 10 kilometers, I still have to wear a mask. If I find a rural officer there, they could find me. Now, I mean, surely we can be a bit more like, I don't know. I just find this, like you live in a little town with 20 people and, you're surrounded by nature and you have the same rules that you have in the city of Barcelona or Madrid. And I just don't understand that because clearly it's two different contexts. So we need to be able to look at the contexts more clearly. I also understand them trying to not, differentiate between people, but And as I think about these things, I realize the complex reality that those governing have had, right? So it's not even blaming them for these things, but we need to have more coherence. We need to have less erratic decision making, and also give people a sense of clarity about when they're going to be able to reinitiate their lives, right? Because what I worry about is that many of those governing, at least in a place like Spain, they tend to be much closer to those on the elite part of the society than they are on the less privileged part of the society, right? So sometimes it seems like they're legislating for them and for their interests rather than for the whole population. And I again, this is just points that I think need to be carefully looked at. That's all.
In fact, I really liked both comments, and I think that they really reveal kind of two sides to the question. One is that the government decision makers are making decisions on a moving playing field to begin with. And so I too, you can't help but have sympathy for them. And I guess I wouldn't see the kind of wellspring of criticism that occurred in Ontario in recent days, Una, as really a problem. In fact, because there are going to be, the government is like, that's the way democracy has to work, right? Governments have to make decisions that not everybody, maybe not even a majority of people will agree with, because it may well be that there's no majority for any particular measure, right? That the ideas of responses are so diverse that there's just no natural coalescence in a majority, and you as government have to make a decision. At the same time, we actually want the mechanisms of feedback that you were describing, Una, to operate, because in fact, it's actually that process of pushback and response that's how democracy works. It's not a problem with democracy. It's how democracy works.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, it raises the issue of social media, right? And how it is providing, it's causing, I know it's causing a lot of problems. It's spreading a lot of really, unfortunately, false news that is polluting people's minds. but it's also a way to do exactly that, right? For people to communicate with each other, to express views on the latest news from their politicians. So it's a lifeline, I guess, for democracy in between elections. It's just, and you could open up a million questions about, well, how do you keep it as a safe space for people to talk about issues? Because I mean, just going back to the issue of women, it's a safe, if social media is a safe place to talk about some issues if you're a woman, but it's a very dangerous place to talk about some issues if you're a woman. So the fact you don't see discussions on social media about issues like, the ones I talked about, women not having enough money to buy menstrual supplies, not having access to abortion, not having access to reproductive health measures, etc. That's not going to be discussed on social media. It's because the women who do that would be crucified, basically. It's too unpleasant a place. But it's okay for some topics, but it's not actually a level playing field for people. And I understand it's the same thing for BIPOC. Anybody Indigenous, they may have similar issues if they raise certain topics. Black Canadians, etc. So this, these social media are super important, but are they reasonably safe places to conduct the discussions?
Yeah, this concept of sorry, Pablo, do you want to jump in before I?
No, I just wanted to say something about the fake news, because I do agree with you about that, about this, whether it's a safe playing field or not. But at the same time, I also have seen a lot of things, a lot of criticisms of the way that responses to COVID have come. I've heard a lot of criticism from different doctors all around the world. They just have as much credibility as other doctors in the sense that they're treating people. And I fear that a lot of the criticism is all being lumped into these are conspiracy theories and this is fake news. And that's what I worry about. And that's the kind of energy that I felt in 2001 when the Twin Towers collapsed, right? All of a sudden, anything that was, opposing what was going on was treated as fake news, as something. And then we went into a war. It had weapons of mass destruction. We destroyed the whole country. It still hasn't recovered, right? And we didn't go back later to really pay serious attention to it. No one got punished for the fake information that the government was feeding, right? So I think we need to, again, I'm not saying that the government is lying, but I do think that it's very easy these days that if you critique what the government is doing, automatically you're seen like a wacko.
I appreciate that. And I think this theme of pushback and response as an integral part of democracy and how to keep that process democratically safe is a really nice transition into our next question. And this questioner, this is from Heather, is wondering about the ways that right-wing populists are trying to undermine democratic institutions. And she's raising in particular the example in Alberta of the chief public health officer there being targeted by right-wing groups for stalking and doxing and threats and disparagement of her credentials, attempts to undermine her credibility. And Heather's pointing out that, for me, I guess she's pointing out the intersection between these attempts to undermine democratic institutions and attempts to further marginalize the least privileged portions of our population. She's pointing out that women are disproportionately the targets of these sorts of tactics, and we might add other marginalized groups as well. So I thought that tied really nicely into this theme of keeping spaces safe for the right forms of pushback.
There have been similar kinds of really unfair attacks on the provincial health officer in BC as well. And it's one of the reasons why I think it is so important to remember what Pablo said about the fact that these are people who are making decisions in contexts that are not easy. And to also remember another thing that Pablo said, which is that political life, not just political life, but life in a society is not just about friends and enemies. It's about finding ways to talk and listen to people with whom you disagree. And it's important to realize that when in a situation like this, there really may not be, there's certainly no single public voice of the people. There may not be a majority position. There's a whole range of options of approaches that may be taken, and there may not be a coalescence around any one of them. And yet we have to find ways to respond if we want to take responsibility for our own futures in this kind of a place. So my own feeling is we have to do exactly our approach should be in forms of input, forms of engagement, forms of structuring that input so that it does allow for people to voice real concerns, not be silenced, as Una has suggested. This really forces us back. In fact, one of the reasons I think we see so much concern in a context like this is a lot of those mechanisms of input have atrophied over time. A lot of the organizational activity that fed into politics at the level of the state doesn't happen quite so much, in quite the same way. People don't interact with people that they disagree with on the internet, by and large. They interact only with people who share their opinions. And we've got to find ways to build that kind of infrastructure of what it means to live in a society and to deal with others.
Pablo or Una, would either of you like to weigh in on that? And if not, we've got a whole list of questions, only a fraction of which we'll get through. So I'm happy to keep plugging through. Okay, great. This one's picking up on Una's point about including non-vocal or other than human entities in democratic processes. And picking up on the example in New Zealand where legal personhood has been conferred on a river. I believe there was a similar development in Quebec recently as well. And so the questioner is asking what sort of mechanisms we can imagine to realize this expansion of our democracy. Is this the sort of tool that you have in mind? Are there other tools you might be imagining? How can you see this developing?
I don't really have an answer for this, but I do think this idea of asking questions from the wrong end might be helpful. I do think that there is interesting work that's being done on issues of new materialism and thinking about the concept of the Anthropocene and what it is. So these are all ways of kind of rethinking who we are and what we're doing. And they may help us get to a point where we're in a better relationship with the environment and the elements of the environment, whether they're living or non-living, but just, our relationship with it. So, there's this whole theory that since Descartes, we have kind of been elevating this idea that reason and the mind is the only thing we can trust, and it's the thing above all else. And there's a kind of a reasonable, there's an argument that can be made that sort of separation from the world, even separation from our own bodies, has enabled a lot of what is considered progress. Like the development of the West has been built on that, and of course that has included things like colonization and the imperial project around the world, and the treatment of others as other. Like everybody who is not my mind is other. And this, as I say, it has enabled us to be where we are today. So there's a lot that is maybe good about it, but it also has kind of hidden this shadow, this thing, which is that we have really alienated ourselves from our own bodies and from the environment and from anything that is not, that we see as other than us. So there's an argument, and if you want to read a really interesting writer, Anna Greer is one, and she writes about this, about how law is expressed in this way, this sort of central, you know, that it's kind of crafted in this way for this one kind of a being, which is, it's almost like we, you know, when we were in law school, the reasonable man, but it's sort of become, perhaps it's not even the reasonable man anymore. It's probably the reasonable corporation, and it doesn't even need to be reasonable because it's an abstract being. And so the law works very well for that being, but it doesn't work so well, as I said earlier, for the rest of the planet. So I do think we have to kind of dig deep into our thought processes. You don't have to buy all of what I just said. I mean, you know, this is, different people would have different theories about it, but I think it's a very interesting thought exercise to try and think, okay, so if we are going to, now here we are at this advanced stage, 2021, this is the world we have. We know we have responsibility for some of this mess. We know that individually we can't solve it, but what can we do that will help to rectify the situation? And I think that's our duty. We all have to do something to rectify the world that we've created and bring a greater harmony between our minds, our bodies, and the world.
I mean, it does seem to me, I was trying to think, what does a democratic right of a tree or a river look like? And the first thing would be that obviously we would have to change our extractive resource-based way of thinking. I mean, you basically, like, if I'm a citizen of my country, you know, for me to get shot, you know, would break all the democratic norms. And I mean, perhaps if there's, you know, the death penalty for something that I've done wrong against the society, I could have the death penalty. But if there were to be democratic rights for the trees, it would ultimately mean that we can't cut them, or if we maybe be able to trim them and use some of the wood, but it would have to be keeping them alive. And we wouldn't be able to, if we think of the democratic rights of our sea or the river, we wouldn't be able to throw all the toxic waste that we're throwing into them. So it actually requires a fundamental transformation of the way humans see themselves in the world, right?
And it is true that there's a huge outpouring of literature that is really very recent that attempts to think through these issues, to kind of respond to these questions. It's a heck of a good question. I think it's one of those questions that now has a whole panoply of potential answers that we're kind of working through. And so I'd really urge the person who posed the question to kind of look out for that literature, because there's some great stuff out there. If I can make one plug for something by colleagues of mine, there's a volume, for example, that's edited by Michael Ash, John Borrows, and Jim Tully, that is on, I think its title is something like Resurgence and Reconciliation, Indigenous Settler Relations and Earth Teachings. And but it's just one of kind of an outpouring of work that's being done that tries to think about how to imagine what it might mean to have a politics that doesn't have the division that Una was referring to, doesn't kind of have this deep chasm between humans' interest and the interests of the world at large.
That connects really nicely, actually, to one of the other questions in the chat. Ian is pointing out that the German Constitution actually has a requirement that the government protect future generations, and that the Constitutional Court there has recently struck down the government's climate change law for not having targets far enough into the future. And that provision actually mandates that the government respect the natural foundations of human life. And so that's maybe another way that we can imagine bringing those into our political process. And I thought it contrasts nicely with what Pablo was saying as well, by drawing out that one set of options is to recognize legal rights for people to have the natural environment they need, but that's very different from democratic inclusion of non-humans, not as an instrumental value to human populations, but as things with their own interests and own right to participate in society, which maybe is a nice summation of the interplay between democracy and rights that has run through this entire conversation. I think maybe we have time for just one more question. We're very close to the end now, but Shannon is asking about efforts by the Canadian government to police and censor online content for the purpose of preventing a reduction of trust in government institutions. And we see around the world, I might add, a real effort by governments to control social media platforms under the auspices of maintaining the integrity of public institutions. I want to comment on that trend and where they see it taking us.
Well, I think generally more conversation is a solution to less. I guess where that runs out for me is where you have non-people participating, where you have these bots that are created by some institution that wants simply to put out fake messages. We're not talking about fake news. We're talking about the whole thing being fake people participating. And I guess my sense is that, well, one can think of contexts in which anonymity is also valuable. But I confess that I think that ultimately it's important. Our tendency should be to try to build a world where people feel comfortable, but do speak in their own voice. And I don't think we should be managing our social media so that we're being preached to robots that are established by an individual with the resources, technical and financial, in order to create them. And I think we should be fostering human interaction, which that is not.
Yeah, I would just comment that, you know, if you look back at what happened in the US election in 2015, and that issue of this fake news that was being created and the impact it had, that is a very frightening story. And I also think the what happened, I think it was January 6th in Washington with that riot, right? That's an indication that something is like physically attacking the institutions of governance in the US. That's like, you know, there's a problem when that's going on. So I understand the sentiment that we need to figure out what to do. I suspect that whoever's working on this in government is very conscious of the danger, right? The downside of, you know, creating sort of a brave new world, or, you know, 1984 type of scenario. We'll tell you the information you need. So hopefully they are. That's because, you know, we do have charter rights that would be engaged by anything that did have that kind of interference with our freedom of expression. But I do think these technologies and their weaponization by states, and we know that's being done, that is a serious issue that needs to be addressed. We need to know more about what's being done on that, because we have to worry about the transparency of our own security forces dealing with these issues and that sort of thing. And then there is also the dimension that the platforms are corporate, and there needs to be some sort of control of that. And I don't know the answers to that, but yeah, that would be a great topic for another session, how one deals with that and promotes this dialogue with people and greater democracy.
I feel like we have enough fodder for several more panels. Expect to hear from me again. But I think we are about out of time, unfortunately, for our discussion. And my apologies to those of you in the audience who asked questions we didn't have a chance to get to. We did the best that we could in the time that we had. But I'd just like to wrap things up by extending a really heartfelt thanks to our panelists for an incredibly rich and naturally flowing discussion. And also to the Center for Constitutional Studies for having brought us all together, and to all of you in the audience for joining and participating and engaging with these issues alongside of us. we certainly live in interesting times, times of great danger and also of considerable opportunity. And I hope you all found today's discussion as helpful as I did in situating yourself in your own work relative to that conjuncture that we find ourselves in. So thank you all for being here, and please remember to fill out your feedback forms at the end of the session as you leave. I hope you all have a wonderful and safe weekend.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.